All right, so we're about a minute after the hour, and I think that we will go ahead and get started because we have a lot of things to say. Um, so welcome everybody. We'll have a few still continue to trickle in, but my name's Pam Schwartz. I'm the Chief Curator of the Orange County Regional History Center in Orlando, and I have with me today my co-host.
Which I'm below you on my screen.
Oh, you're there on my screen. She's somewhere.
So I'm here. I'm Kathryn Duffy. I'm the Curator of Exhibitions at the History Center. I've been with the History Center about 1.5 years, and this was I feel very honored to have been able to work on this project, especially with our team who did a lot to contribute to it, which we'll talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, you'll see our talking heads today, but it takes a huge crew to make this thing happen. So, all right, well, a couple of just housekeeping things. Kathryn and I both have dogs, and we are teleworking because of the pandemic. And so when they go crazy, you might see one of us mute and go like this, and that is the sign to the other one, which is you need to take it from here because my dogs are losing their mind. There's a male person outside or something's happening. But we'll continue through and we'll try to mute to keep out some of that noise in between. So bear with us. We will be sharing our screen and doing a variety of different things throughout the length of the presentation. Now, we would love to have questions. So, excuse me, please put those in the chat box if you have them. We'll try not to miss them. We might not be able to address them right the minute as we're going through, but we'll try to take some sort of as we go, if it makes sense. Otherwise, we'll definitely leave time for questions at the end. So do please put those in there and we'll address as many as we can, okay? So going ahead and getting started, thank you again, everybody, for joining us from all over the place today. I point at the list like you know what I'm pointing at. That's the chat box. You know, as long as we've been on Zoom, we're still figuring it out. And by we, I mean me. So yesterday this was home, the Ocoee Massacre of 1920 exhibition is our most recent at the History Center. We've been working on this exhibit for around 3 years. I really keep meaning to look back at the calendar and figure out the exact date. We had our first meeting with the community, with community members from the Democracy Forum, and also some others throughout the community. But these individuals came to us and said, hey, the 100th year mark of this event is coming. We did a lot of work back in the 1990s, early 2000s, and we have some archives and things that we'd like to donate. And that was from, again, the Democracy Forum. And we looked at their archives, we talked with them, and we said, yeah, this is beyond due. This is 100 years beyond due for us to really start talking about and have an exhibition. And so the work started there. And it was a very interesting process. We had a lot of different things we sort of decided early on. And one of the first things was that there wasn't very much to go on. There had not been a lot of historical research on this event. There had been some, but there's a lot of sort of intentional obfuscation over time. There were records that should have been kept at the time that weren't kept. A lot of different things at play. Also, the Ocoee Massacre, a lot of the community was burned to the ground, and so things just don't exist. And so we are going to go through just a brief overview of the actual massacre and the actual event that happened, but also talking more today about really the behind the scenes of the exhibit, and going through all of that, I think. Kathryn, do you have things to sort of add before we just sort of jump right into the intro? Further intro?
I'll just echo, maybe you touched on this, that although there was not a lot of information when we first started out to build out the main thesis of the exhibition, which is the Ocoee Massacre, regardless of that, we wanted to focus on using primary sources, really sticking to the facts and allowing the facts as best we could find them throughout the entire exhibition to do the storytelling for us. It was important for us to make sure that what we were sharing and what we were putting on the walls was not going to be contested or disputed, that there was no denying how difficult this history was, and what we are working through and dealing with today as well.
Yes, exactly. So, Kathryn mentioned primary sources. We went through thousands thousands of things for this exhibition. Again, you know, as historians, we sort of have a different standard of what we accept as truth and what sort of documents we look at. Now, we look at a lot of documents beyond primary sources, but again, this exhibit, we were really hyper-focused. And I had mentioned that there was this lack of information, a lack of documentation. Now, most of that coming to the Ocoee Massacre was by design. African-American and Black records throughout American history have not been well kept, generally speaking, but specifically surrounding these events of racial terror. And so where do we start? How do we fill a 3,200 square foot exhibition gallery when there's nothing to put in it? And so that's when we sort of made this decision to broaden the scope of the exhibit. An event like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's not singular. These events happened across America, unfortunately, and there was a lot of things that led up to it. So I often talk about that as sort of like a simmering kettle. It's boiling and boiling faster and boiling faster until it just goes over and it makes a mess of the stove, right? So we decided, where does this story, you know, we talked, where does this really begin? Where does the story begin that allows something like the Ocoee Massacre to happen in 1920 in Ocoee? Not someplace else, not another time, right here, right now, at that time. And so that's when we made a decision to go all the way back to enslavement in the 1500s. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But from the 1500s up to Ocoee, and then on the other side, bringing that all the way up to today, there are these themes we look at in the exhibition that unfortunately hold strong for hundreds of years. And so we thought it was really important to go from the start up to how events like this still impact us and how they still unfortunately relate to the things that are happening in America. And again, we're going to talk more about that, but that's sort of an overview. The exhibit is open right now. We opened October 3rd and will be open through February 14th. It is a pandemic. We'll talk about the impacts that's had on the exhibit. We do have timed entry. So if you're local, we hope you'll get a chance to come. That timed entry is meant to help spread people out. But if not, later, that's not what we're doing today, but later, come January or February, we are planning a full sort of virtual tour of the exhibit. So you won't be able to read every text panel, but you'll get Kathryn's and my full curator-led tour, less behind the scenes, more on the scene, if you will. So what we're going to do today, like I said, is we're going to walk you pretty quickly through the exhibit. We are going to show it to you. It's kind of a sneak peek. It's meant to make you just like want to come so bad, right? But it's a little bit of a wobbly video because I'm only so steady-handed and didn't have the appropriate equipment doing this. But we'll go through, and what we're going to do is sort of just quickly talk you through each of the sections. And I'll talk about the Ocoee Massacre and the brief overview of the story when we get to the Ocoee section. So just sort of stay tuned as we go through, and we'll give you more background if you're not already familiar with it. Kathryn, anything to add, or shall I bring up that video?
Let's roll the tape.
It's not great, like I said, but Kathryn, just tell me if you want me to sort of pause in a certain section.
Sure.
And we'll go from there. And hopefully everyone can see this. Let me make sure. We don't have volume on the video because it's just me clicky-clacky walking around. Okay, so I'll go ahead and play it. And Kathryn, if you want to go ahead and take it away for a little bit.
Before you start, before you even hit play, what you see in front of you there, that wooden box with looks like 2 screens on it, that's the first voting station or voting booth that you'll come upon in the exhibition. There are 5 voting stations throughout the entire exhibition. And the reason why we wanted to include these are interactives. They have questions that pertain to specific sections of the exhibition in which they're placed. And what they really do is serve to provide deeper dives on some of the content that we either felt would be too lengthy to put on the wall, or for more, if you wanted to dive in and learn a little bit more about some aspects of what we touch on in the exhibition. It certainly provides an opportunity to kind of mix up the learning styles, but also it's a reflection of the perspectives of our visitors. So at the end of each of these questions, not only will you see your answer, whether it was right or wrong, but also where you fall on the spectrum compared to other people who have used that particular voting station.
One thing I'll add that we're not going to talk about a lot. We did a coffee with a curator a while ago that really talked a lot about like the nuts and bolts design of the exhibit, but some sort of fun little, Easter eggs. We picked this really rich, deep color palette. We went through, I don't even know how many tens of hundreds of fonts to pick the right fonts. But in terms of the voting station, we wanted this very rich wood and bold color look, but you'll also notice the light bulb on the sort of industrial pipe there. This was all meant to be a very cohesive design decision making, and we sometimes add symbolism that most visitors probably don't even pick up on. So I don't know if we're doing it for ourselves or for them, but in this case, you'll notice that light bulb. It's sort of like, come here, have an idea. That's symbolic. Also, sort of be drawn to the light. Be drawn to the light and express your voice or your opinion. And so we're hoping that everybody stops sort of at every one of these stations as you move through, and you really stop and have an idea and think about what you're seeing and what you're reading.
Yeah, opportunities for reflection and participation. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Best of luck. I hope everybody took their seasickness pills.
Yeah, Dramamine. Okay, so as Pam mentioned, since we're walking through this piece, all the materials, the lighting, everything was incredibly intentional. The sparseness in some areas, the spotlighting, it's hard to see, but that's our iconic tree and vinyl. It's part of the exhibition logo. And so as Pam mentioned, we start the narrative in 1513 when Ponce de Leon arrives to Florida with Africans. Not too much longer later, the first enslaved Africans are brought to Florida, and that's what we're sort of walking through in this section. This very long and intentional oppression and suppression that even after, so if you want to pause it, Pam, you see this family living in Florida, trying to carve out a living, and even after emancipation, this systematic or systemic notion of oppression continues for centuries after. The emancipation of slaves was not a quick fix for anybody. It took decades and centuries to build a lifetime and build generational wealth and growth. And that's where we start to weave in some of those threads. There are essentially 5 themes that you'll see throughout the exhibition that focus on voting, education, incarceration, property, and labor. And as we were researching, we found those pieces of life to be where the strongest amount of oppression has historically and again systemically and systematically occurred, but also those sort of avenues provide the greatest opportunities for growth and gain. Voting, of course, being the most prominent as it pertains to the Ocoee Massacre. So what you're looking at there is not just this family in the 1870s, but also on the right-hand side, that sort of bluish paper is an early Florida Constitution, which written right into it are oppressive laws. Only white men can serve on a jury, for example. And then as we sort of spin through this area, we start to see what I've referred to as this push and pull, these gains and losses, and they may be forwards and backwards, but they're lateral and up and down and all around. You have individuals like Mary McLeod Bethune, whom you see standing there, really pushing forward voting rights and education rights. Then you have white cappers and the KKK lynching. Here's another voting station where we talk about, or where we offer up a voter registration quiz, which is very challenging, and I won't give too much away. I just hope that you come and take it. And then we kind of round this whole section out talking about voting and the forms of voter suppression that existed leading up to the 1920 Ocoee Massacre. So the 2 horizontal pieces of paper you see on the left there, do you mind putting your mouse on that, Pam? Are you able to do that? No. Yeah, okay, they're there. So those are poll tax receipts. So if you wanted to vote, you needed to pay your poll tax. Hopefully you can keep going. Hopefully you'll spin around to the right, and we can also point out another significant moment. Yes, which is women.
Like a twirling dervish over here.
That's right. Wait for it. Which is women getting the right to vote only months before the 1920 election. This is not only significant just in our national history, but there was then these new blocks of voters, white women and Black women, and the roles that they played in shaping that election. And Pam mentions the simmering kettle, and for Black women to gain the right to vote, to have the right to vote, became very contentious. But also there were this huge block of voters who could sway the election in either direction. So they're also very valuable. And then from here, I think we start moving into how did we lead up to the Ocoee Massacre here in Central Florida?
Yeah, so keep in mind, this is a very cursory overview. There's a lot of information. We're going to go through the tour and then come back and talk about our research process for some of these different sections. So I'll kind of point out when we're going to be coming back to talk about some of these things, just so you can kind of keep them in your visual reference here. So like Kathryn was saying, all of these events are leading up to 1920. And so we thought it was so important to bring all of that context up. As we walk into the Ocoee section, we actually step back a second and we look at how Ocoee formed. What is its sort of genetic makeup come 1920 when this event happens, which is all important. And so we had to do a lot of research to sort of figure out what the landscape was like. Ocoee, of course, is then impacted by all the same types of events as what's happening across the nation. And so we bring those back around here. World War I shaking up the economy. There's a lot of young Black men who go into the service. Women's suffrage, there are plenty of women, Black and white, in Ocoee who would like to vote. And then there's this Black voter registration drive going across America. So I'm going to kind of break with the briefness that Kathryn was just stating to kind of actually give you the background of the Ocoee story for anybody who maybe isn't actually familiar with it yet. Again, the hardest part of doing this exhibit was how much misinformation is out there. So if you're a person who's Googled the Ocoee Massacre, much of what you've seen isn't true or might not be true. There are actually a few facts that are really sort of provable through primary sources. So one thing I'll point out is this letter here in the middle of the screen next to these two men. Some of the things we look at is that push and pull of things happening. And so that sort of resurgence and rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this letter was sent about a month before the massacre, and it was sent to these two white men you see. These are local prominent white Republicans who had been out helping to educate the Black community about registering to vote and getting active. Of course, they're Republicans. Many Black individuals voted Republican at the time. If you know your politics, you know the parties were switched, but often that is how that worked. And so they receive a letter. This is a primary source. We have the original in our collection, though this is a facsimile so that we can make it larger. And it basically is a letter from the Ku Klux Klan of Florida telling these men to stop what they are doing. Do not enfranchise Black voters, or else. It's signed to or copied to the local Ku Klux, asking them to watch these too. So we know that there was voter suppression and intimidation happening. I mean, that is a source that says that. It's verifiable. Next to that are some news articles. Now, that was a month before. Now, just days before the election, there are marches throughout the state of Florida by the Ku Klux Klan. Jacksonville, Daytona, Orlando, some 500 people strong in full regalia. And these are parades, but these are parades with a really haunting message. That is, if you're Black, don't vote or else. And these things are happening, and all of these are the types of resources that we're using to research this. Now, coming around this corner here, eventually coming around this corner, I sure took my time. You'll note there's sort of two opposing walls here, and sorry that it's blurry when I pause. I'm not sure why it's like that, but this wall on the left with all of the yellow, we had a few different staff working on this project. But again, there's so much misinformation. I'm going to come back and actually, I'm going to talk about this right here just because I also show you how the resources screen works. But one of the really in-depth research projects that we did was to take 129 different versions of this story. Now, these are versions that are from academics, survivors, descendant family members, random people who are just interested in the topic. We took 129 accounts and we synthesized them into one long account. So you can actually read this in line. And it's sort of like one of those choose your own adventure stories. If you've ever seen, like, you can go down this hallway, or you can go down this path, or you can go up to the attic. It's sort of set up that way. But if you really take the time to read this, you start to see where this narrative gets twisted. You start to see where there's faults of memory. You start to see where maybe somebody just misheard or misunderstood. Now, some of these accounts definitely hold some validity. You'll see that there's white text sort of laced throughout. Now, what we did was we took 129 resources, put them in line, and then we boiled them back to what we could actually prove was true. Now, that's through the use of primary sources or through what all of these accounts agree upon, right? There's no sort of other version of that. And that's what we're left with, is the white text that's laced in. We took that and we put it over here on the right. And I apologize. I wish we could actually read that, but we cannot. But these 4 paragraphs from about 14 or so pages of text, we're left with 4 paragraphs of what we can factually say. Now, really, this is a very cursory sort of view of what happened. There's a lot of different nuances. There's a lot of different versions of this story, but these 4 paragraphs are what we can say is true. And essentially what that says is that on November 2nd, a man by the name of Moses Norman, who was a Black labor broker in Ocoee, went to the polls to vote in the presidential election. He's turned away. Again, there are many versions in between, but the next fact that we know is that an armed white mob goes to the home of his probable friend and fellow labor broker, July Perry, also a Black man. Somehow violence breaks out. There's a fight. There's shots are fired. This white mob begins to burn structures that Black individuals are living in, or churches, we don't really all know, to the ground. Fast forward through the night. And again, there's a lot that we don't know, but there's what we do know. And some of the facts we point out are how many people were killed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and how we sort of come to those numbers. But we know July Perry is lynched and that an unknown number of structures burns to the ground. Now, popular story has always said that all the Black individuals living in Ocoee fled that night, never to return. And we know that's simply not true. And that's through some more in-depth research. But the community is definitely left in shambles, and people are fearful for their life. July Perry is lynched. We know others have died. Again, we'll kind of come back to that. But that was what this whole exercise was about, is 129 versions, but this is all we can really say is fact. Now, when you're looking at each of these 129 versions, there are numbers next to each one of those facts, and that's a citation. So you can actually pick any one of those numbers, say number 43 or whichever, and go up and click it on this screen and read it. You can read any one of these accounts. You can say who said, or see who said this, when they said it, and what the rest of their story is. There's audio oral histories. There are videos that you can actually look at as well. And so this is important for a few different reasons. This shows you, it really relates to today, I guess, is the point, that there's a lot of misinformation out there and how quickly it can spread and get twisted if we're not checking our sources and if we're not looking up what is fact or fiction. And we all know this is a big conversation today. And so this was a huge part of our practice of just getting down to the facts. You'll note this cabin here on the right. The exhibit is called Yesterday This Is Home. We'll kind of come back to talking about the importance of that. But we know that we didn't have the time to break down every single fact of the Ocoee story because there's just too much and there's so much that we can't prove. So on the left, we talk about land research. I'll come back to talk about that a little bit later, but that's another in-depth project that we did. We made an interactive land deeds map that you can actually explore those different properties. The next section, we actually talk about the deaths and how we come to arrive at the number that we claim as historians to be true, which is at least 4. And I'm going to pause there. Man, I hate that that's so blurry. Sorry. We talk about the deaths. We talk about voting and whether Moses Norman was actually exercising his legal right to vote or not. We talk about the fact that this didn't end at November 2nd, 1920. The terror continued over the next year, over the next 4 or 5 years, eventually driving the entire Black community out. We know there's a lot of dark legacies to this event. And so this is a big and important section where we talk about those legacies and their impacts on the family members who descend from those survivors or those who didn't survive the Ocoee Massacre. We actually have had the opportunity to do oral histories with several descendant families. Again, another thing that we'll come back to talking to. We also talk about the fact that for the next half of a century, Ocoee was an all-white, essentially sundown town. And it wasn't for about 50 years until the 1970s that any Black individuals started trying to move back into Ocoee. And even then, they were still met with racism. Again, that's a very quick overview, but that's kind of bringing us up to the end of where we stopped there with the Ocoee story. So that's sort of section 2. And now we're heading into section 3, which is post Ocoee, if you want to take that away, Kathryn.
Sure. So as Pam mentioned earlier, the Ocoee Massacre was not a one-off. It was not the only type of situation of its kind. Maybe the catalyst or the reason behind it was unique to Ocoee. But Ocoee is just our story of destruction of Black prosperity, Black property, and oppression. And so can you pause it for a hot second, Pam? Can you go back to the left a little bit, please? My left. So what you're seeing in front of you is an image of a burning cabin in Rosewood, Florida, which is not that far from Ocoee, west of Ocoee and northwest. And that's just another example 3 years later of an entire Black community that was destroyed by the hands of angry white men. There's also a map in the far left corner, which shows all of the lynchings and several acts of racial violence towards Black people, but also Native Americans, Asians, Italians. And this was something that we were very fortunate to have on loan from this organization called Monroe Work Today. And so Monroe Work and his wife, Florence, essentially spent their lives and their careers collecting information on lynchings across the United States as they were happening. So their work started in the late 19th century and went into the 20th century until he passed away. That collection now lives at the Tuskegee Institute, and it was used to create this map. So you can zoom into any location in any state and see what types of lynchings occurred there. There's some general information about the circumstances and that sort of thing as well. So we move from these examples of multiple acts of racial violence against individuals, as well as groups and communities, and we start building up to the civil rights movement. So that's what you see as you're looking to the right-hand side. That's a picture of Emmett Till and his mother. The large building there is the house of Harry and Harriet Moore, which was bombed in Mims, Florida. Again, another Central Florida community. Harry was working for the NAACP. He too was also recruiting Black voters. He and his wife fought for equal pay for Black workers, specifically teachers. And what you can't see is a picture of the Groveland Four, also a Central Florida story. So all of these things are happening. If you think back to this simmering kettle concept, you start to see that as we lead up to the civil rights movement. And all of that was happening here in Central Florida, as well as a few other important places in the South. We can keep going.
Do you want to talk about the cabin a second and sort of that symbolism as we go through?
Sure. So a couple of things, wanted to provide a space where the most difficult content, imagery, and concepts that were going to be discussed would be optional for visitors. So we decided to essentially create this space where they could choose to enter or not. And as we were thinking through the contents of this area, we realized that this concept of home is not only significant in that it illustrates loss of prosperity, loss of community, but it's also socially speaking, culturally speaking, where racial sentiment can be born or can be perpetuated by families generationally, but it's also where change can occur as well within the home over the course of only a quick generation. And so this notion of the home and the sentiments that are bred in the home, we were able to illustrate that here in this cabin as well. So inside the cabin, I don't know if you go in there.
We're not going in there, no.
You don't go in. Okay, there's a little radio inside there. You can just make it out. And that has a loop of the 1940 Superman radio show in which Stetson Kennedy, who infiltrated the KKK and essentially shared the information with the government, sort of helping to bring them down. He also used some of the information he gleaned and fed it to the Superman radio show. And they had episodes where Superman was beating up members of the Klan of the Fiery Cross and making fools out of them, essentially. Right next to the radio, we have Stetson Kennedy's KKK robe on loan from the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And so when you are able to come, I highly encourage you to check that out. It's a very ominous looking robe, but has such a positive story attached to it.
Now that's in comparison to what else is in the cabin, which, you know, is like photographs of lynchings. There's tourist letters home about a hanging they went to in Orlando. That was just a really, really great time. And just these sort of different ways that people were, you know, sending racist postcards to their grandparents, like really different ways that people were so complicit and complacent with this type of racist behavior and terror.
Yeah. And then we pivot back out and we start delving into the civil rights movement, specifically here locally, but really ending at the major legislative change that came out of that movement. There you see Martin Luther King Jr., who had visited Central Florida during the civil rights movement. And there's another voting station. If you could pause for a quick second. So this wall on the left here, what we did overall with the exhibition, we zoomed way, way, way out in section 1. We talked about the first people of African descent setting foot on American soil, which just so happened to be in Florida. And we narrowed our scope way, way into the Ocoee Massacre. And then in this section, we've once again zoomed out and addressed those 5 themes that we had started talking about in section 1. So voting and education, incarceration, property, labor. And so what you're seeing on the left-hand side here really talks about those themes today, from Ocoee into today. And what was challenging about this part of the exhibition as we were making it, not just as we were designing it, but as we were, not just as we were writing it, but as we were designing it. Our designer has a lot of patience because we had to make a lot of changes because things were changing as we were writing the exhibition. So for example, House Bill 1213 passed. There was Amendment 4 was being contested and we didn't know whether or not we would be able to include it or what the outcome of that was going to be. Now we have to update that very far panel to the right where we talk about on November 3rd, millions of Americans are going to cast their vote. We have to update that and talk about what happened. And we still don't know.
If we ever have results, if we ever have.
Right, right. And so that, what we wanted to leave visitors with is helping them understand the value, the power, and the importance of voting, and participating in elections. And also, there are some resource cards they can take away for additional information on what books should I read to learn more about this? What community groups can I get involved with? That sort of thing. And then, do you want to talk about this one, Pam?
Yeah, I was trying to get to the resource cards and then go back. I did it out of order.
Okay, those are the cards, yes. And so if you'd like to learn more about how do I even start having a conversation about race, there's some great talking points that the National Museum of African American History and Culture provides for us that we've included there. How do I register to vote? How do I learn about the candidates and the platforms on which they are running? All of that information is on those little cards that you see there.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump back here to this, which isn't going to be clear. Oh, kind of. So this is sort of a step out of order. This is sort of part of that conclusion to the exhibition. One thing you might have noticed is that we definitely wanted to have many voices involved in this exhibit, not just like sort of our authoritative curatorial voice, but also very much other people's voices as well. I can't get to my mute button. Sorry, I don't know how to stop it. You guys, shush. Okay, sorry for bearing with me. I'm on the video, so I can't get to my mute button. But that was just the postal person. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Sorry. We wanted to have many voices involved. Kathryn's going to talk about our focus group in a minute, but that one wall has 129 voices. All the survivors we've been able to find by doing genealogy sort of forward, we have in the exhibit. We're going to be adding 2 more within the week that we've just met. But we wanted to take these oral histories that we've done. We've wanted to get these messages and put them in a way that was really accessible for everybody, whether you're a school-age child on up to any other age. So I'm going to actually in a little bit towards the end, actually play you one of these that we made. We worked with a local artist, Thomas Thorsbecken, former Disney animator, an illustrative journalist, who did each one of these in a different style, but you can kind of click those and sort of watch and enjoy these stories in a sort of different way. So that's an important thing. Again, we'll play one of these, the Sammy Jennings one, for you in a little bit. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Sorry about those docs. But that's a really sort of quick overview, walkthrough of the exhibit. And so we do want to talk about just, we talked about a little bit as we were going through, but there's a few different specific research parts that we worked on. There's the entire design of the exhibit, the colors, the fonts, the hierarchy of the text. These are all things that we've been working on for years. But then the research is really the meat of this thing. We thought it was a great idea to research several hundred years of history. And so we had to dig really deep to look for some of that information, because like I said, a lot of the Black history has not been well kept or well recorded, or accurately recorded is maybe more accurate to say. So we talked a lot about the primary sources and the types that we use. Again, we look at a lot of different things. Doesn't mean we trust everything. No. In some cases, we're looking at documents we would trust in a certain story, but that for the Ocoee Massacre, we can't. Can we trust a death certificate usually? Usually. But can we trust it when it comes to the Ocoee Massacre story? Not necessarily. And so we really had to have a lot of deep staff conversation of looking at all these different stories. And Melissa Procco, who's our research librarian, just did an incredible job helping us to synthesize all of this information. And I don't even know how long we talked over that sort of 4-paragraph version of the story to make sure that each word was an intentional choice that wasn't going to blur the meaning. Like we talk about July Perry after he's taken by the lynch mob, we say he was brutalized and ultimately lynched. Now there's a lot of versions of what exactly the grisly details were of what happened, but we don't know any of them. And so brutalized was the best, most authentic word we could come up with to let you know how horrific something had been that had happened, without saying something that was not factual, if you will, right? Again, there's a lot of conflicting sources, and there's ongoing research. That's a big thing for us. We've edited this exhibition already. Kathryn mentioned that, with sort of new things that are happening, but we're also continuing to uncover old things. Just in the last week or so, we found 4 more property deeds that we didn't know about because these individuals hadn't been listed in where we started, which was the 1920 census records. The 1920 census records had over 800 some individuals listed for living in Ocoee, 255 of which were Black, in 78 family units, 22 landowners. But now we know that it's probably closer to 280 or so Black individuals living there. 26 landowners have been accounted for. And so there's just a lot of different facts to the story that are continuing to come out. But we have our gentleman, RJ, who made our map for us. And actually, why don't I bring that up? I'll show you. This map was a huge part of our research. And this is eventually all going to live online where people can access it. But this was a huge thing we did, was looking at the genealogy and who lived in Ocoee and who didn't live in Ocoee, and trying to figure out what did it look like. And we'll still never know. There were a lot of renters. Every Black person living in Ocoee lost something that night, but we'll never know where those renters were living or what they had. But because of land deed transactions, we can actually track the sale of property. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. Hopefully you can come to the exhibit and explore it more. But our staff, several people, found over 160 some land deeds, transcribed them. If you've ever looked at old handwriting or tried to read it and map it, it's really difficult. It's like 6 chains to the southwest of the southwest corner of the northeast quarter of the 22nd meridian to Tallahassee. Like, try sorting that out. Was really, really difficult. And so we had several people working on this, and then ultimately handed the mapping off to RJ, who was amazing, who runs Art Studios in California, and did a really great job. So what you can do is slide through this map that starts in November of 1888. Now, blue is white land ownership and yellow is Black land ownership. I'm actually going to zoom out a touch. But you'll start to see as we go through the timeline, this rise in prosperity of the Black community as they're buying more and more properties. This is kind of hard to do on my computer. It's easier. We have that big touch screen in the exhibit. But so at the time we get to the 1920 massacre, this is roughly the Black land ownership. Again, we're going to be adding a few more properties in here that we found. But this is really important to us, again, to figure out what the properties look like, but to also work with our descendant families. If we click this property, we can see that what white people this was purchased from, by who, and who they sold it to for how much. This particular property, 21 acres, was sold at a 99% loss. Now, this was very common. And again, I can't get into all the semantics about all the property stuff. I just wanted to show you that one of the most important things is looking at what that land would be worth today, $715,000, this one property. The grandson that we are in touch with would have been heir to $1.3 million of property. And so there's these conversations about reparations. We've heard these on a lot of different ways, but this has been a really big thing for the families to be able to know where those properties are at and where they live. So you saw that 30-year rise in prosperity, and then in just 6 years, all of those properties are back into white ownership. This was a major, major part of the project for us, and it's really hugely important in terms of just trying to figure out what was happening at the time, and really how horrific it all was. There are a lot of things that I still want to talk about, but we're going to be running out of time. Kathryn, do you have any points you want to make before I maybe play the Sammy Jennings video and then we take questions?
You mentioned the focus group, so I'll just first of all thank them all. I'm not sure if any of them are joining us today, but so essentially in planning for the exhibition, we wanted to ensure, first of all, that we had the right voices, we had a diverse perspectives informing this project. And so we reached out to scholars and community individuals in our community, a number of different people from different backgrounds to not just help advise on some of the decisions we were making on the project, but also help us gain access to some of the resources that we needed to be able to appropriately tell this story, to provide feedback and input on the decisions we're making. Pam mentioned how carefully we chose our words. We actually ended up creating a style guide for the use of, when talking about race, the use of specific terms. And so our institution adopted this style guide and they helped us sort of lay eyes on that project and offer up their input. And so we, you know, it was truly, I can't say this enough, it was truly a team effort on our staff's side. Pam and I worked very closely together on this project, but we did not want to create this without the voices of the community being a part of it as well.
Lots of people involved.
Mm-hmm.
So Kathryn, do you want to take the time? Should we show the animation, or do you want to go straight to questions? We don't have many in the box yet. Why don't we do this? If you've got some questions, put them in the chat box. We'll play this video because it's just a couple minutes. Does that work, Kathryn? Yeah. And it's good. Again, this is we've had a lot of young learners come through who've really loved watching these videos and hearing testimony of people who lived it. So the particular video I'm going to play for you is actually Sammy Jennings, who was part of our youth NAACP council here in the 50s and 60s, and tells a story that might sound familiar in some ways here. Let me bring this up. This is really complicated to do videos. Okay. All right, can we see this? Hopefully.
Yep.
My wife would call him thrifty, but my mother always called my dad stingy. Even though he bought me all these Christmas presents and this and that. So anyway, the bus was probably $2 or $3 cheaper than the train. So instead of going on the train to Detroit, which I love, I had to take the Greyhound bus to Detroit. So I got on the bus in Orlando and said 4 seats from the rear. That was the battle line I had drawn. And I was determined that I was going to fight it to the end, to death, defending that. And I wasn't going to move. Again, everybody behind me was black. When we got to Winter Park, this black girl got on, she was a teenager. I was 12, so she was probably 15 or 16, something like that. And she was going to Detroit too. And so when she got on, we started chatting, and I said, look, I said, you know, the bus driver might tell us to move back, but if he tells us to move, don't move. I said, we have a right to sit here. The law says that when you're traveling with commerce, you cannot be segregated. She said, okay. Everything was cool. The bus rolled on out of Winter Park, and we got to Jacksonville. The bus driver got off, and he came back on the bus and came back to us and said, would y'all please move back to the back? We got some white people getting on. I remember he was a younger guy. Obviously, he didn't have the attitude of this other driver. And so I just gently pressed down on her arm or thigh so she wouldn't move, as a reminder. And I looked up at him and I said, sir, we have a right to sit here. I said, we are traveling in interstate commerce. The law says that we can sit anywhere we want to. Pam, I was scared. We were in Jacksonville. You just mentioned Jacksonville. Jacksonville was like being in Mississippi. he said, well, I got these white people getting on, would y'all please move? And I just said, no. So he turned around and left. And that's when I was really scared. Because this was right the year after Emmett Till had been lynched. And, you know, all those warnings my grandmother had taught me about talking back and being uppity to white people. And I didn't know whether they were gonna come back on the bus and kill us. Finally came back on the bus and these white people were trailing him. And he led them to the back of the bus behind us and they sat down. And I felt a combination of relief, felt vindicated, but I also felt afraid because I didn't know what was gonna happen for the rest of the trip to the South, which was all said and done. But that taught me, after that trip was over, that I could stand up for my rights and survive. So that probably instilled in me that seed of rebellion against the system that really blossomed later in the 60s when I was in high school.
Great. Sorry again about my dogs. Again, that's another way just for us to make history, have the voices be heard of the individuals who've lived this history or experienced it and make it really accessible to all different ages. 4 questions. I think we've got a couple. How did you decide to display Kennedy's KKK robe without empowering it or causing additional trauma to viewers? Kathryn, would you like to take that?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the most difficult content, we knew we didn't want to just leave out in the open for people who would opt not to see it, learn about it, what have you, experience it in some way. And so before you enter the cabin, the home that we built in the center of the gallery, there is a disclaimer that provides you the opportunity to opt out. Because the KKK robe is tied to such a positive story, such a change from other materials from the KKK that are on display at other institutions, including our own. We do have an authentic KKK robe. We felt comfortable displaying it with the story that this wasn't used for evil, this was used for good. This was used to essentially bring down the very institution that had designed and created the robe. And so by providing that option to view those materials, including the robe, we felt comfortable displaying them.
And, you know, for the negative things in that space, I'd add, it's all about how you choose to interpret, right? So just because you put something on the wall doesn't necessarily give it sort of power, unless people take it out of context, right? But in this case, for some of the sections where we have like the images of lynchings as entertainment and the racist postcards, we chose our words to say this is horrific behavior, or this was you know, I don't know if we use the word disgusting. I mean, don't quote me on that, but like we chose these words to be like, this was not okay. This is still not okay. And so again, objects sort of have the power that we give them and they have the meaning that we assign them. And that's very much the case. And so we were very intentional about how we interpreted those objects, very much so, to make sure to try our best to not have that be the case. We have a question. How accurate is the book Ocoee by Myra Cheney? It's a matter of what you're interested in terms of history, right? It is a fictionalized account that has some facts laced within. So just be aware going into that it is a specific narrative. The background of that book is actually kind of interesting. One of the authors was in like real estate and saw that there was like a black family listed in Ocoee, and she's like, wait, what? Black people don't or didn't live in Ocoee. And so that's sort of like what spun off their research, but it is a fictionalized account. So keep that in mind. There's no, I wouldn't say personally for me as a historian, an accurate sort of storybook account. And to lead right into another question, somebody had asked if these animated oral histories will be available online. We are raising money, and if that is something you're interested in donating to, let us know. But we are trying to raise the funds right now to take this entire exhibit, which will close in February, and turn it into a long form online digital storytelling platform, very highly interactive. It'll have the resource station, it'll have the land deed map, it'll have these oral histories. The goal of that is to make all of that very accessible. Kathryn, do you want to talk about, I mean, you kind of touched on the HB 1213 bill, but do you want to sort of say why we are so insistent we want to be able to put that up? And yes, there has been talk about us doing like a full exhibition catalog, sort of a printed book version that we're still figuring out, fundraising in 2020. So.
Yeah, so I mentioned that things were changing as we were developing the exhibition, even installing the exhibition. The sort of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement was happening, and we knew we wanted to include that. But also the passage of House Bill 1213, which was really pushed by Ocoee Senator Randolph Bracey, but it requires schools to teach about the Ocoee Massacre. And so having gone through this process of being challenged to find accurate information and being very aware that there's a lot of misinformation out there, we want to ensure that there's a resource for educators to go to that can feel confident that the information they're using to create their curriculum and teach this class or teach this portion of their classes is accurate, is reliable. And so we also not only want this website to serve as this digital storytelling piece where we can include these animations, we can include these interactive maps, but also a surefire and reputable source of information for educators to teach future generations about this event.
And not just educators. I mean, the website will be available for anybody. And we hope to sort of design it in a way where you can like fall down the rabbit hole in the ways that most interest you. You know, it won't sort of be straight to beginning, but there's going to be a lot of layers and interactivity to that. Question, is it clear that race is still an issue that we are experiencing today? Was that something that you would think about when creating the exhibition, like the things you were seeing and learning and how they could be applied to the times we are living in? You know, Kathryn kind of talked about that where we wrap up our themes at the end. The exhibit brings us up to today. We changed, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement started here in Sanford with Trayvon Martin. And so as we're doing this exhibit, George Floyd happens, the murder thereof. And so we were very sort of constantly reacting to the history as it was happening. And that's basically what you leave the exhibit with, is this is still very much an issue. A lot of things have gotten better, but more things probably have not. And so we all have to take individual action towards that and making a better world, honestly. So is this the first exhibit about the massacre in Florida? Our permanent galleries have always had have included the Ocoee Massacre, but within the context of 14,000 other years of history. So it hasn't been so large scale. This is the first comprehensive, I mean, I think beyond even our permanent exhibits, the only exhibition of this material anywhere. So we do hope again to make it accessible, not only statewide, but nationwide and further and beyond. Were there any stories from the Ocoee riots or massacre that couldn't be verified as fact, but were highly likely to have occurred? I mean, I guess that could almost be said for anything. When it comes from a person or it comes from somewhere, a lot of things are likely to be true, because otherwise, why would people say them? But like we said, we looked at 129 accounts and you can see it get really twisted. We, again, really stuck to those facts, and it doesn't make all those nuances less important. Now, rather than saying there are things that are highly likely to have occurred, we do have a text panel in the exhibit where we say, these are things we find interesting, but haven't been able to verify. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they're likely to have been true. It just means that if they were, that might change a kind of a big part of the narrative, right? So one of the things that's missing is the grand jury report. If we could find that grand jury report and read those 20-some testimonies from white individuals, one Black individual who was able to testify, there's probably more things that we would be able to uncover, but it's gone missing. Just like with Rosewood, the grand jury reports are missing. There's this sort of fantastic story about them having sent the the justice of the peace out fishing that day, and he had the sign up that he was out fishing. how would that ever get verified, and how is that, you know, possibly sort of true in terms of getting those like verifications and things, right? Like some of this stuff is just, and that's not to say it's not true, but you'll never ever be able to actually know that if Moses Norman went to try to verify or get a copy of the tax receipt from his poll tax, or if he went to pay his poll tax so he could try to vote, or whatever it was, you know, so there's a lot of details. How long will the exhibit be running for, or is it permanent? This is a temporary exhibition. It will close in February 14th of 2021. However, we are redesigning the museum over the next few years. And so all of this has also been research for those permanent exhibits, and for us to make sure that our exhibits are more inclusive of our entire community's history, are more in depth, etc. So a lot of this research, if not only the online portal, will continue, will continue some form of or life within our permanent exhibitions as well. What was the most interesting or surprising thing you learned while creating this exhibit, Kathryn?
How can you pick just one? Well, mine,
do we have
since
an hour? Is there another hour?
We'll just extend this afternoon and learn. So just to give you an understanding, maybe we skimmed over this quickly, of the delineation of roles, so to speak. Pam's research and work really focused on the Ocoee Massacre, and mine focused on before and after. So I'll speak to one of the most interesting points that I learned during this process and through my research, but certainly not the only one. So in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Essentially, separate but equal was not equal. And so integration of schools across the South, across the United States, started happening. So this was 1954. It took 20 years for Orange County to fully integrate its public school system. And the process that we do talk about in the exhibition to have that happen, to essentially force that to happen, was arduous and long and painful. Not only was it required by law to integrate schools, there was another lawsuit brought upon the Orange County public school system by parents of students who were no longer willing to wait for their children to have the same educational opportunities and the same educational resources and facilities as white children in their community. And even under that litigation, it took decades to desegregate. So that's just one of many, but I have lots. So I'll just digress and leave it at that.
Every single thing I said about Ocoee surprised me. Just how intentional everything has been, and how systemic and systematic it has been for hundreds of years. I mean, we would reconvene every day and be like, how is this permissible? How do people support this? How do people let this keep happening? Just how little people even tried to hide it. After the massacre, a white man by the name of Bluford Sims took over the executorship of the Perry land, which is like a whole separate presentation. But he put an ad in the newspapers, in the Sentinel. He put an ad that said, "Special bargains, beautiful little groves for sale of the Negroes that just left Ocoee." They didn't even try to hide that they had pushed out Black individuals and were now selling their groves at premium prices, right, where they were in control. Black families trying to sell their own land didn't have quite the same pricing structure available to them. So just how blatant it has been for so long is just one of, again, many. Could you expand on the role Judge Cheney played in bringing change to Central Florida? I think that there should probably be an entire separate lunch and learn about the Cheney family, multiple levels of individuals and generations. But Judge Cheney was very involved with the Black voter registration and educating people. There's a lot of versions of the story of what actually transpired with Judge Cheney on that day. But he was also really involved with with the whole Utilities Commission locally and the buying and selling of that. He actually died just a couple years after the Ocoee Massacre happened. And sometimes I think people wonder whether that was almost a heart attack as a result of the things that had happened over those couple of years of the sale of the commission and everything that happened with Ocoee. So definitely an interesting individual, but I do think that'll have to be another topic for another day. There's a link here for programming you can all enjoy. I'm not sure. I think we have a specific link for donating specifically to the Ocoee website. I don't have it on me. I'll see if I can get a hold of that. But otherwise, you can just email either Kathryn or I, and we'll be sure to get you the information about that, because we have had donations specifically put into that fund of really making this content hyper accessible, which of course is like super important this year. Digital humanities are always a really important thing for accessibility to information, but obviously it's the world we're living in. So we're hoping to get the funding together to do that, and to have that available by the time the actual physical exhibition closes, if not a little bit sooner. So we'll sort of see. I put my email address in, we'll put my email address in here, and I know Kathryn has dropped hers too, but you can feel free to reach out to either of us with more questions, or if you would like to make a donation, that's fabulous. We really appreciate it. Or if you have more questions about sort of what that actually means, just let us know. Any last questions before we sign off? We've gone a little bit over, but that always seems to be the case.
We always go over. So Katie, one of our wonderful educators, dropped in a link to the related programming, or rather programming related to the exhibition. So do keep in mind, if you're local or if you're able to travel here to Central Florida, there are a couple of free family days coming up. And so if for any reason, if admission is a stumbling block or a barrier to accessing this exhibition, click on that link and you'll learn when those free opportunities are to visit the exhibition.
Yeah, and other great events. And we will be adding a couple, like I said, I think we'll be doing a full, like sort of more in-depth couple-hour deep virtual tour a little bit later in the exhibition run. But yeah. Okay, doesn't look like we've had any more questions, but do feel free to reach out to us. We hope you enjoyed it. Again, we could offer lunch and learns on almost every single thing we've barely touched on, but we just wanted to give you a little bit of the background and the inside baseball on how we as curators and an entire incredible, again, keep in mind, this takes exhibit staff and collection staff and our front of house staff selling tickets and our education staff doing programming. It takes every single person in our museum and so many people from our community, from Democracy Forum and other groups, our focus group, who've made this exhibit really possible and really incredible. So again, we hope you get to see it. If not, stay tuned for that virtual tour and other programming, and have a lovely weekend.